Welcome to the October 2022 meeting of the Wildlands Middle Tennessee chapter. I am Richard Hitt, the current president. We are delighted to have Jessie Taylor from the International Crane Foundation with us tonight. I would like to turn the program over to Paul Prill, one of our board members, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Take it away, Paul.
First of all, kudos to Richard. Unless you work the plant sale, you have no idea how much work is involved in putting this thing together. And for I don't know how many years, but it's just amazing. So kudos to Richard. It's always also nice to find partner organizations. People are interested in the same sorts of things that we are, and realize that we have 8,000 members, and we'd like to have 80,000 members or 800,000 members. There are other organizations who are doing some of the heavy lifting on some of these issues related to sustainability and ecology. The International Crane Foundation works worldwide to conserve cranes in the ecosystems, watersheds, and flyways on which they depend. They provide knowledge, leadership, and inspiration to engage people in resolving
come watch something
threats.
on cranes?
Cranes. Did I miss this?
I think Brian needs to mute himself.
I am so sorry. I am muting right now. Oh my God.
No, it's not a problem. Not a problem. I thought maybe I'd misspoken. And these are not the cranes that you see downtown in Nashville. Just
Right.
just so you know.
A good host would have hit the button that muted everybody, and then
We provide knowledge, leadership, and inspiration to engage people in resolving threats to cranes in their diverse landscapes. The organization was formed in 1971 by two ornithology students at Cornell University. In 1973, a farm in Baraboo, Wisconsin, gave them the farm for $1 a year rental, which is not too bad. Overhead costs are pretty low that way. And so they moved to Baraboo, Wisconsin. There are offices and staff in China, Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, South Africa, as well as Texas. The International Crane Foundation works through strong partnerships with local organizations, governments, universities, businesses, and others in these regions. More than 125 staff and associates work with a network of hundreds of specialists in over 50 countries on 5 continents. Probably makes plant sales go a lot easier if you've got that many people on the staff. The nearly 300-acre global headquarters in Baraboo, Wisconsin, hosts a captive flock of 100 cranes approximately, including the only complete collection of 15 species in the world. Our speaker tonight, Jessie Taylor, is a 2019 graduate of Auburn University. So all you Alabama fans, please keep it down, okay? During all of this. A degree in wildlife ecology and management. She's worked with the International Crane Foundation as their Whooping Crane Outreach Program Assistant in Alabama for the 2021-22 wintering session and for the 2022-23 wintering session. So she's at work right now helping them. She loves all things nature and teaching people of all ages and about the cool things they can see and find in their own backyards. So Jessie, have at it. We're eager. And now I'll mute.
That was like the best intro. You guys did your research. Thank you guys. That was awesome. Let me share my screen real quick. Hang on one second. Hopefully you'll be able to see this pretty well. I have to say, I'm not as familiar. I used to be a lot more familiar with native plants as I am now. Back in school, we had tons and tons of plant classes that I had to go through, but if you don't use it, you lose it. And I unfortunately have lost a lot of that information, but I'm still learning more every day. And just hearing you guys talk right before this presentation, I've already learned so much. I need to get a water wiggler for a bird feeder out front, or a bird bath out front. So just to kind of reiterate what Paul said, my name is Jessie Taylor, and I work as the Whooping Crane Outreach Program Assistant for the International Crane Foundation. I do most of my work out of Alabama, so I focus more on northern Alabama and southern Tennessee, just to kind of raise awareness about the cranes that we have in our area and the birds that you may see flying over your area. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. And you've already said all of this, but the mission of the International Crane Foundation is that we work worldwide to conserve the ecosystems, flyways, and watersheds on which these birds depend. So we do have offices in over 50 countries on 5 out of the 7 continents. And so we all have that one common goal of conserving these places where the cranes dance. And most of the cranes, they're all facing relatively similar habitat destruction situations. And so we have multiple wetland restoration projects that we're working on. And up at our headquarters in Baraboo, Wisconsin, they actually have completely kind of revived the old prairie landscape that used to be there. So we have people that are out seed collecting every day, trying to populate new areas of our headquarters property that used to be more of like I think it was a sandy pine soil, and then we're kind of trying to convert that back to those natural prairie landscapes that used to be there. But I got to learn a little bit more about that while I was up there in September. But again, plants are not really my strong suit, but I'm going to try to bring in as many plant facts as I can that these birds are also kind of using at the same time. So let's see. So in Baraboo, Wisconsin, we are seated kind of in the land of the Ho-Chunk people. So this is a slide that we usually read verbatim just to acknowledge the fact that the Ho-Chunk people are gracious enough to let us use their land. So the International Crane Foundation headquarters in Baraboo, Wisconsin is located within the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people. We acknowledge and honor the Ho-Chunk people as caretakers of the land and water since time immemorial, and as our neighbors, friends, and vital members of our community. The International Crane Foundation is dedicated to amplifying the local voice and perspective in all places where cranes dance. So there are 15 species of cranes that can be found all over the world. This is what they all look like. So you may notice that they do have quite a few features in common. So you can see that for the most part, they all have those really long, narrow beaks. They have a long neck, and then kind of subsequently you can gather that they would also have long legs and be pretty tall. And then something else that you may notice is that most of these birds do have a red forehead patch or some kind of red on their head. And we'll kind of get into what it is in just a minute. It has to do with communication between different birds, but we'll go into that in more detail shortly. Out of these 15 birds, though, we do only have 2 native cranes to North America, and those are going to be our whooping crane and our sandhill crane. Our whooping crane being one of the rarest birds that can be found in North America, and our sandhill crane, which is the opposite end of that spectrum, is one of the more abundant birds that we have. It is the most abundant crane species with about 830,000 in their population, and we're going to get into the numbers of the whooping cranes in just a little bit, so I'm not going to tell you that just yet. I'm going to keep you on your toes and make you wait for that one. But out of these 15 crane species, 10 of them are considered threatened or endangered, and that does include our native whooping crane. So we're going to go over what caused the decline of these birds and what we're doing to kind of build their population back up now. So to start off with, I'm going to go ahead and start with our sandhill crane. Oh goodness, let me make sure. I'm going to share my sound. Sorry, I forgot to do that. I'm going to share my sound here. But this is what a sandhill crane looks like. I can't really see all of your faces right now, but if you've seen a sandhill crane before, maybe you can throw in a little hand raise or something in the chat. Hopefully, you've at least heard of a sandhill crane before, maybe. Let's see. I'm trying to see. Has anybody ever seen a sandhill crane before? Few of you? Awesome, cool. Sandhill
I've
cranes
seen
are
a flock of them flying over Alstill.
cool, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen them flying over Alstill Nature Sanctuary in Brentwood.
Cool. They are on the move right now, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. You may start to see and hear some of them fairly shortly. We do have word that there are some that have left Wisconsin, and so once they start traveling south to their wintering grounds, you will probably start to hear and see them a lot more frequently coming up in the next couple of weeks. So keep your eyes open for them. But sandhill cranes, they are the most abundant crane species with about 830,000 birds. And they are the smaller of the two species that we have in North America. They stand at about 4.5 feet tall with a wingspan of about 6 to 6.5 feet. And there are some subspecies of sandhill crane, but for the most part, we are going to be focusing on the greater sandhill crane today, which is the one that you see here. So the sandhill cranes have an all over gray coloration. And so you may be thinking this picture does not look like an all over gray bird, and you would be correct in thinking that, because this is an example of an adaptation called painting that these sandhill cranes will use. If you can imagine, I'm going to grab some of my feathers here. Maybe you can see them pretty well. So this is what a sandhill crane feather looks like. So they're a really kind of pale heather gray to a dark charcoal gray on their bodies. You can imagine that may not blend in very well in the landscape. And so that painting technique is actually pretty impressive, at least in my opinion, because these birds have the ability to sense iron in the soil. And when they find these iron-rich pockets of mud in the soil, they'll take a chunk out of it and paint all over their feathers. And that iron will then oxidize and, in a way, rust their feathers to act as a camouflaging technique to help them kind of protect themselves from other predators. We're going to talk about predators too. I guess I can go ahead and talk about them now. When these birds are full grown, they're pretty big birds. And so there's not a lot of natural predators of the birds once they grow to their full size. If you get like a very brave juvenile bald eagle who really has not learned its limits yet, if you get a spry coyote, they might try to go after one of these birds. But for the most part, these birds are big enough to where they don't have a lot of natural predators on the landscape. Historically, it may have been like the Florida panther would have been a predator of these. So there's not as many as there used to be. But the sandhill crane, you can see that it has that bright red forehead on it. And behind me, you can kind of see in the picture behind me, and we're going to get to this in a second too, of the whooping crane. So they both have these red heads on them, and that acts as a way of communicating between these birds, not necessarily between the sandhills and the whoopers, but you will also see this between sandhill cranes or just the whooping cranes. So when you're driving down the road and you see something that's red, that usually means that it's a stop. And so this forehead patch, it's not feathers. It's not, I get a lot of people that ask if it's red feathers, but it's actually a bald spot. So this bald spot right here is heavily, it has a lot of veins in it. And so these birds have the ability to kind of up their blood pressure and increase blood flow to their head, which in turn causes that bright red patch to be brighter or more dull. And so these birds use that red patch in order to communicate with other members of their species in a way that's like, hey, you're getting too close to me. I need you to back off. You need to stop before we have problems. So it's a way of communicating. A lot of times you'll see these birds have really bright foreheads if they're being territorial, and that may happen during a breeding season or in their wintering territories as well. So, and that goes for both of the crane species that we do have in our area, but I'm going to go over what these birds sound like, because it's very common that you will hear these birds much more or much sooner than you will see these birds. And so if you guys have ever heard this before, you will know that it's a pretty unmistakable sound. So a guard call, they're going to be doing this when they're either flying or in their wintering roosting spots. I do hear this all the time. So if you ever do get the chance to see wild sandhills, you will most certainly probably hear this. So this is what their guard call sounds like. Could everybody hear that okay? Yeah, okay, cool. So that's what their guard call sounds like. Some people will tell me that it kind of reminds them of a turkey. I don't personally hear turkey in that, but I'm always in the mentality, if it helps you remember it, then go with it. So that's what a sandhill crane guard call sounds like, but they also do have another call called a unison call. And they will oftentimes do this when they're with their partner or with their mate, just to kind of keep tabs on where they are. But when they're doing these unison calls, oftentimes they're throwing, the male and the female will both be kind of close together and both throw their heads back at a very similar angle, almost like they're mirroring one another, which is really interesting to see. But this is what that unison call sounds like. Wait, that's the guard call again. There we go. That's kind of that back and forth call. Very cool to see in person and hear in person. So just like with our sandhill or with our whooping cranes, our sandhill cranes are going to have those long necks, long legs, and long beaks. But swapping gears now into our more endangered bird, the whooping crane. I just skipped all over this. I already talked about the painting. This is a close-up painting picture that shows those oxidized feathers in that really pretty gray coloration. And this is a comparison between that light gray color here on the bottom and this more painted coloration up on the top. If you're familiar with cranes, you may know that the juvenile birds, they do have a more cinnamon color feather on them that can resemble these painted feathers, but I'll show you a side-by-side of those in a minute. And if there's not one, I think there's one in this PowerPoint, but if there's not one, I will definitely let you know and I'll pull it up. So this is our whooping crane. I think this is actually the same picture I have behind me. But this is what a whooping crane looks like. And they are going to be North America's tallest flying bird. So they are bigger than the sandhill cranes that we have here. They're going to be about 5 feet tall. So I know you can't really see me for reference, but I'm 5'7". So having a bird that's really close to beak to nose with me, I wouldn't want to get very close to it in the wild, but they are very, very impressive birds. They have about a 7.5 to 8 foot wingspan, and they're very, very large. Really unmistakable with any other bird once you know what you're looking for. We're going to get into some commonly misidentified birds, but for the most part, if you kind of see these characteristics, you'll know that you're looking at a whooping crane. So something that makes whooping cranes different from any of the other water birds that we have in the Southeast is going to be their facial patterns. So there are other large white birds that do stay around water, but none of them that are going to have these same kind of facial patterns as a whooping crane. So they still do have that red forehead patch, but something that is unique to the whooping cranes is this mustache right here. So no other birds are going to have that mustache mark that extends past the corners of their mouth. And so if you can see that mark, that is a telltale sign that you are looking at a whooping crane. Sometimes it is a little bit difficult to see the size if it's not standing next to a sandhill crane, or if it's really far away, it can be kind of difficult to determine size. But if you can see that mark on its face, it is 100% a whooping crane all the time. Let me see. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so they also do have a guard call. When they're in their wintering territories, we don't hear it as much. I have only seen and heard a guard call or a unison call one time in the wild, and that was over at Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge in Decatur. It happened one time that I know of while I was there last season. So it is pretty rare that they'll do this on their wintering grounds. You will hear this more often when they're in bigger flocks or when they are in their breeding grounds, which are in Wisconsin. So this is what their guard call sounds like. So that may be an indicator as to why they get their name, the whooping crane. Their voice box is pretty low down in their chest. And so once that sound travels up their really long trachea, it comes out as that whooping sound. So that's where they get their name from. And they do also have a unison call. something that's interesting about the unison call that you wouldn't really think of unless you kind of knew about these birds, but what you can't see in this photo here is that these birds have a stark difference between their wingtips and their body. So their wingtips are black, and you can't really see that when they're standing or waiting. The only time you can really see those black wingtips are either when their wings are spread out while they're flying, or if they're stretching, or when they're doing a unison call. And so during this unison call, you'll have a male and a female, and there's no physical way to tell the difference between the two just by looking at them. So when these birds are doing their unison call, one of the only ways that you can tell which bird is the male in that relationship is that when they're in this unison call, the male will drop his wingtips kind of below his wings and then expose them, and that's the only way that you can really tell these birds apart from one another. The females do not expose their wingtips, and the males do. We're not really sure why, but it is very helpful when you're trying to figure out which one is which. So this is what that unison call sounds like. And same way with our sandhill cranes, they're going to be throwing their heads back at about the same angle, and their body posture is going to be very similar, almost like a mirrored image of each other. Yeah, pretty short and sweet. There is another way that you can tell the males and females apart from one another if you do hear that sound. If you have a keen ear, you may have noticed that there are 3 calls and then 2 calls happening. So one bird is doing a repetition of 2, and then another bird is doing a repetition of 3. And the bird that's doing the repetition of 3, I believe, is the male. But unless you have really trained bird ears, it could be really difficult to tell that apart from one another, or tell those apart from one another. I'm still not very good at it, but like I said, I don't really hear them making this unison call very often. I've only seen them do it once. But it is really just a cool spectacle to see if you ever get the chance to. Let's see. So again, they're going to have that featherless red patch on their forehead. They're going to have that black mask. Something that is different about the whooping cranes compared to the sandhill cranes is where they're going to be staying more often. So the whooping cranes are very much more so wetland dependent than our sandhill cranes. Our sandhill cranes, it is very possible that you will see them in cornfields or outside of the very near vicinity of water. But whooping cranes, they are much more wetland dependent, and so they're going to be focusing on areas that are really mucky and muddy, and have some of that shallow water. It doesn't necessarily have to be a wetland, but anywhere where there's water, that's where they're going to be finding most of their food. And these birds are omnivores, so they're going to be eating things like frogs, snakes, salamanders. They'll also eat the roots of plants. I know in their breeding grounds, they like to eat wolfberries, but they'll also be gleaning bugs off of those flowers and those plants as well. And then in the crop fields, what they're eating is leftover corn from the growing season. So this is a good photo that shows those really pretty black wingtips. I think these birds are very beautiful. I'm a little biased though, I think. But this shows a really good example of how these birds are going to be flying. And this can also set them apart from other birds that you may see in your area. So when these birds are flying, all of the cranes are going to be flying with their necks straight out in front of them and their legs as far out behind them as they can go. And so that really sets them apart from like a goose or a heron or an egret that we may see, just in the way that they're flying. But also having that stark difference between that black and white of the wingtips is a really good indicator that what you're looking at is a whooping crane as well. So these are some birds that are commonly misidentified as whooping cranes. And if I wish I had some ID guides to give out to everybody. Usually we would give out ID guides to everyone. But this is these are some of the birds that get misidentified for whooping cranes fairly often, or just cranes in general. So over on the top left, we have our American white pelican, and I have seen some of these fairly recently, so they could be in your area as well. But when these birds are flying, they do have a fairly similar wingspan to the whooping crane, and they do have those black tips on their wings. So when they're very, very high up in the air, when they're flying, it can be pretty difficult to tell these birds apart from one another. But one of the ways that I like to tell them apart is not only they have short legs, they don't have those long trailing legs behind them, they have a short neck, but the pelicans have that really bright orange beak. And our whooping cranes and our sandhill cranes are going to have a dark gray to a black beak. And so if you ever see a glimmer of orange, you know that you're not looking at a whooping crane or a sandhill crane. So that's my advice on the pelicans. So with snow geese, similarly, they don't have those really long legs behind them, but they're much smaller than a whooping crane would be. And again, depending on how far away you are from these birds, it can be kind of hard to tell the size. So again, going back to looking for that mustache and that red forehead, you would know that this is not a whooping crane or a sandhill crane. Some of the most common birds that I get asked about, or people tell me, oh, I have a crane by my pond, or I have a crane that lives in the creek behind my house. 9 times out of 10, it's probably going to be a great blue heron or an egret. And there's a couple of ways that I like to use to tell those birds apart from one another. So I have, this is my replica of a leg. Hopefully you can see it here. So this is what a crane foot would look like, more close in size to a sandhill crane, but the whooping cranes would just be a little bigger than this. You can see that they don't have a very long back toe or halix. Some people call it a hallux. But that back toe in birds helps them to grip onto branches. And so because these birds do not have a long back toe, you are never going to be seeing them in trees. So great blue herons and egrets both have really long back toes. You can kind of see in the photo of the heron, you can see that back toe really extended out while they're flying. If you can see a really long back toe, that's a small way that you can tell that these birds are not cranes. Again, having that red forehead patch, neither of those birds have that. And so then you can deduce that it's not a crane by that. And also when these birds are flying, instead of flying with their necks straight out in front of them, they're going to be curved in like an S. And so having that S pattern in their neck is a dead giveaway that these birds would not be cranes, but they would either be a heron or an egret. And then again, just for the sake of being confused with whooping cranes, we do have our other crane, which is the sandhill crane, that does get confused for a whooping crane sometimes because they do fly the same way. But some other ways that you can tell these birds apart: no mustache, and this bird, you cannot really tell a very sharp difference between their wingtips and the rest of their feathers. So that's a good way to tell those birds apart from one another. So I asked if anybody had seen a sandhill crane before, but has anybody ever seen a whooping crane, either flying over or maybe in the wild? No? Okay. If you do get the chance to go see one of these birds in the wild, I would highly recommend it. They are very impressive to see. Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge is probably from Nashville, I think it's about 2 hours, 2.5-ish hours down I-65. So we are about to begin our crane season down here. The birds are on the move. Hopefully they'll be showing up by the beginning of November. But we do have a whooping crane that spends a lot of time at our observation building. I like to call her Reba because she's a sassy redhead that likes to be in the center of attention. But Reba loves to stay over by the observation building, and she usually gets fairly close to the building so people can get a really good up close look at her, which is something that you don't get very often without binoculars or a spotting scope. So if you get the chance to come to Wheeler, I would highly recommend it. I also think there has been crane sightings at Joe Wheeler State Park, which is a little closer to Nashville. But for the most part, they're going to be flying over Nashville into those wintering areas down here. So hopefully you get the chance to see one. They're really, really neat. So the sandhill crane I mentioned earlier that it is the most abundant crane species that we have in North America, or in the world, but it didn't used to be. Back before the 1950s, there was only an estimated 20 to 40 birds left, or not birds, pairs left, I'm sorry. So they got down pretty low in numbers. So much so that if you've read a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, it's kind of like the wildlife book. But in Marshland Elegy, Aldo Leopold said, "The sadness discernible in some marshes arises, perhaps, from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humbled, adrift in history." So when Aldo Leopold was writing a Sand County Almanac, we did not have a lot of cranes left at all. So I like to think that if he was around now, he'd be really proud of the work that everybody has put in to get these birds into such a population that we don't really have to monitor them anymore. So how we did this and why it's important, not so much, well, the how is more so with whooping cranes, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the biology of sandhill cranes. And so both crane species, when they are of age to start breeding, which is around the 4 to 6 year old mark, they will find a mate and end up mating for life. Now, that's not to say that divorces don't happen in the wild, but it is more rare. But the only reason that these birds would ever remate is if that other partner were to die, or if there have been multiple years of unsuccessful nests or an infertility problem, they may split up and then go find another mate to hopefully up their chances at producing an offspring. But once that breeding age comes about, at about 4 to 6 years old, they only lay 2 eggs per year. And that's not just for the sandhill cranes, that is also for the whooping cranes. And you can kind of gather that with that, they're a pretty slow building species. They're not adding a lot of animals to the population every year. So it's really important that we are protecting these areas where these birds are breeding. But there's a couple of different reasons for that. So even though these birds lay 2 eggs, 99% of the time, only one will hatch out. That second egg kind of acts like an insurance policy. So once that first egg hatches, that second egg then gets discarded and pushed to the side so that all the energy can go into that baby that's already hatched. So once those birds have laid those eggs and once one of those birds hatches out, they're very cute. They look like golden little chicken nuggets. This is about how big they are, about 3 days old. They're an extremely fast growing species. So these birds get from egg, well, let me see. There we go. They get to egg to about full grown in about 3 months, growing at about 1 inch a day. But there's a couple of different reasons for that. When these birds are small, they cannot fly. So their really only defense is going to be their camouflage. The areas where these birds are going to be really muddy. Their nests are going to be filled with dead reeds and dead plants. So having this brown coloration helps them as much as it can escape from predators. But they can't really fly at this age, so they do kind of make easy targets for coyotes or birds of prey. Even in their eggs, they're susceptible to snakes and raccoons. So it's kind of hard just to even get these birds hatched out. And then even more so when they are hatched, keeping them away from those predators. So this is a good example. This is what I was mentioning earlier about the difference between the juvenile plumage and the painted plumage of the adults. So you can see right here, this little chick in the front, little knobby knees is real cute. But you can see that there's a different kind of texture to those feathers as there are on that adult. And so that's a good way that you can tell these birds apart. Also, they don't get that red forehead patch until about 12 to 18 months of age. So they won't, the last feathers that they lose are going to be right here on their forehead. So that's kind of the last characteristic of cranes that come about when they're getting their adult plumage. So that's a really good way that you can tell the juveniles apart from those other birds that are painted. Also, those painted birds kind of are a little bit more of a dull brown, whereas those babies or colts. Those colts are more of like a cinnamon color. That's a good way to tell them apart. That's just a photo of where these birds may be roosting. So sandhill cranes, even though they do spend a lot of time in agricultural fields, they do also spend a lot of time in those wetlands as well, because that's where a lot of their food is going to come from. Now, these birds can eat, I think it's between 500 and 800 kernels of corn every day if they wanted to, but they are also looking for those higher protein items, so those frogs, snakes, salamanders in those wetlands as well. And so this is what an adult sandhill crane would look like with its mate and a little chick down there. So sandhill cranes, they're pretty abundant. Like I mentioned, you can find them all over the place. And there are some subspecies of sandhill cranes that we have in North America. They actually have one of the longest migrations of the cranes. So some of them can breed up here in Siberia, and then they'll migrate all the way down into Mexico. So it's a pretty long migration, but the birds that we have that visit us either in Tennessee or in Alabama, most of them are coming from around the Great Lakes region and traveling south from there. So in our migratory population, most of the time what you will see is our greater sandhill cranes. Those are the most abundant cranes that we have, but it is possible that you'll see those lesser and Canadian subspecies that are just a little bit smaller. The non-migratory birds, there are a lot. If you've ever been to Florida, you will know there are sandhill cranes everywhere. So there is the Florida and the Cuban and Mississippi sandhill cranes in our non-migratory populations. And then those Cuban and Mississippi sandhill cranes are actually on the endangered species list. So ICF has just recently, within the last few weeks, started talks of trying to maybe come up with a reintroduction plan for those Mississippi sandhill cranes. But that is in the very, very early stages. But if you keep up with ICF, you may notice in the next year or so that we're coming up with some species recovery plans and survival plans for that Mississippi subspecies of sandhill cranes. So these birds, they do travel here over the winter time. Most of the time we are seeing these birds in the southeast in between the beginning of November till about Valentine's Day. So you'll probably, like I said, be seeing them or hearing them pretty shortly coming right over Nashville. And so you'll kind of see, based off of our GPS transmitters and off of our band reports, you can see that these birds are kind of populating here in North Alabama, but they're also spread out throughout Tennessee as well during their migration. So February, we do get start to see a decline in how many birds are here. And then March, even fewer birds are here. And then April through September, we really aren't seeing these birds at all. But then starting in October, we may see some start to come down, but in November, that's when it really starts picking up again. So over at the Hiawassee Wildlife Area, which I think is fairly close to Chattanooga, if I'm not mistaken, they have a Sandhill Crane Festival every year. So if you're kind of close to that area, or if you're just interested in learning more about the sandhill cranes that are in Tennessee, that would be a great place to go. Also in Alabama, we have Festival of the Cranes, and I have a slide at the end. I'll come back to those in a minute. But it's really good if you want to come see these birds in the wild. Seeing these birds up close, it's always cooler, in my opinion, to see these birds in the wild than over a computer screen, but I'll take what I can get. A cool bird's a cool bird. So let's see, going back to December, still having a good population there. Yes. Okay. So these are some areas that you may see these birds in. You're going to see them in those wetlands. You'll also see them in ag fields. But as in the case of Florida, we see this a lot more in Florida. These birds are inhabiting places where people are as well. And so they're going to be kind of going toward those people to kind of solicit food from them. Or on the other hand, it's most of the time people saying, oh, there's a really big bird. Let me try to hand feed it, because that sounds like a great idea. And then those birds end up getting kind of dependent on people for food, and that can not only be dangerous for the people, but also dangerous for those birds as well. let me see. I'm going to try to move my toolbar here. Hopefully I can move that. Yeah, there we go. So we do, part of ICF's mission is that we work worldwide to conserve the wetlands that these birds are using. And something that's pretty sad about that is that we've lost quite a bit of our wetlands here in the United States. I think in Alabama, we've lost 50%. And then all over the country, I believe it's about 80%. Estimate, yeah, 80% of the wetlands from the 50s. And that's just, wetlands are very easy to convert into hospitable areas for people. Wetlands are fairly easy to drain. They're fairly flat. And so that makes a good kind of easy transition into those areas that we can build houses on and build neighborhoods for people, which is kind of sad because, you know, in my opinion, we don't need any more Dollar Generals, but we need more spaces for birds. So hopefully we're going to be working more so towards habitat restoration of the wetlands for these animals. There are lots of colleges and universities that are working with wetland restoration projects. I know ICF is in they're doing wetland restorations not only in North America, but we have a really big wetland restoration project going on in China and in Asia for our gray-crowned and black-crowned cranes. China is experiencing a really bad drought right now. And so we're trying to figure out what we can do to help those birds while they don't have that access to water. So that's a really cool project that we have going on. But we're just trying to raise awareness so that people know that we need to keep those wetlands, and the wetlands that we do have, we need to keep them clean and as pristine as we can for these birds. All right, why am I not moving here? I'll do it that way. All right, so these are some other ways that these birds may kind of decline in population. Unfortunately, due to those people that are feeding these birds in their backyard or kind of inviting these birds to get closer to them, these birds are kind of getting dependent on that, which can lead to situations like over here in the top left. So this is a picture of some birds and a pair and two juveniles that are walking across the road. And you can probably tell why that's not a very safe thing for them to do, but these birds don't really think anything of it. But that can lead to mortality via car collision. Also, people just don't like these birds in their ag fields. So this is more so an issue in northern states, I've found, because when these birds are in our area, our crops have already been plowed. So it's not so much an issue as here as it is up north. But we do have some farmers that have raised concerns about these birds and crop depredation. So these birds, like I mentioned, they can eat tons and tons of corn kernels every day. And so when these kernels are planted, when they're starting to bloom, they'll have a little green sprout coming out, and that's like a little flag saying, hey, I'm here, I'm a snack, come and eat me. And so that's not necessarily something that these farmers are wanting. And so we have worked with other organizations to come up with a repellent called Avapel. And so this is something that's put on the seeds before they're planted that causes those corn kernels to have a bitter taste to them. It's not toxic to the birds at all. It's just one of those things. It's like, ew, that tastes weird. I'm going to go try to find somewhere else that has corn. And it has been proven to work, and it is an effective repellent. Something else that can be detrimental to these birds when they are in heavily populated areas, the sandhill cranes, they are pretty territorial. And so if they do see their reflection, they can cause property damage. So this is a picture of a bird who's kind of going after its own reflection. And one of the ways that if this were to happen to you, one way that you can prevent it is just by covering up and putting a tarp over your car. So this is just kind of going back over those threats. There are 17 states currently that allow sandhill crane hunting season. Alabama and Tennessee are two of those. I'm not so familiar with the Tennessee sandhill crane hunting laws as I am Alabama. But I do know that in Alabama, it's a 52 to 53 day season, and each hunter is only allowed 3 birds per year. So out of those hunters, only 400 of them draw tags out of the system, and that's how they are chosen to get that hunt now. But Alabama is the newest state that has inducted a hunting season, and it was started back in 2019. So urban expansion, land conversion, just habitat losses in general, challenges to the Clean Water Act. So not having enough clean water for these animals to be in is an issue for them. And then also high voltage power lines and wind farms. Please don't think that we are anti-green energy. We are totally not. We support green energy 100%. But one of the downfalls that comes with green energy is that there are those expansion of power lines coming off of those windmills. And so this is something, hopefully it won't blur it out on me, but this is something that we may use in that case to kind of prevent these birds from running into power lines. And this is a flight diverter. So it does have these reflective strips on them, and it kind of goes in the wind. So the power line would go right through here. And then it kind of catches the attention of those birds to say, hey, there's something over here, fly over me, fly under me. Because a lot of those power lines are in these birds' areas for roosting. So it's where they're going to be coming down from those super high flights or going up into those flights to those other areas. But power lines can be detrimental, not only to cranes, but lots and lots of other birds. So having those power line diverters are very, very helpful for those animals. I know in North Alabama, it may be more common in Tennessee as well. Those big red balls on the power lines, you've probably seen those before. That's another power line marker that can be used to help deter those birds. But sandhill cranes and whooping cranes, they are not a predator species. They are a prey species. So their eyes are going to be on the sides of their head, not on the front, like a human or an owl or anything like that. So it makes it very hard to see straight on in front of them. And so by having those diverters that move and reflect light, it can kind of get their attention a little bit better rather than a small little power line that's running right across their areas. All right. So swapping gears now into the whooping crane, which is the bird that I know more about than sandhill cranes, but I think they're both really cool. The whooping crane is the rarest of the crane species. It is not necessarily the most endangered. The most endangered crane is the Siberian crane, but the rarest is the whooping crane. And so what the difference is there is that the rarest just means the lowest in numbers with the whooping crane, but the Siberian crane, even though it does have larger numbers in the wild, it is a decreasing population, whereas the whooping crane is an increasing population. So our Siberian cranes, those are our most endangered, but our whooping cranes are the most rare. My buttons are not working on my computer. That's all right, we'll do it this way. So historically, these birds were found all over the northern part of North America and some down into Mexico and on the southeastern coast here. So they were never really as abundant as the sandhill cranes, and we have gathered that based off of fossil records. And we can only estimate that there was about 10,000 whooping cranes at their highest point. So just like the sandhill cranes, the whooping cranes declined really drastically right before the 1950s. And so where there was about 20 pair of sandhill cranes left, there was only 20 individuals left of whooping cranes at one point. So very, very, very low population size. And even though that is not a lot of birds, we still don't have as many birds as we would hope to have, but it's a lot better than 20 that we have now. So what caused this decline? Unregulated hunting was a big thing. Back before the 1940s and 1950s, not a lot of people paid a lot of attention to hunting seasons, bag limits. A lot of those didn't used to exist before the 1900s in general. And just like if you're familiar with the passenger pigeon, everyone kind of thought of wildlife as a free-for-all. they said there's so much of it, it's not going to matter if we take 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 birds. There's so many, it's not going to make a difference. But if you remember, these birds are very, very slow to reproduce. And so even just taking one out of that population is going to kind of hinder this species' ability to grow as fast as we would like it to. So unregulated hunting was a big reason that these birds declined. Egg collecting was another one. So the question that I had for the other people that worked at that work at ICF was, why would egg collecting be a decline in the population? I didn't understand why people would want to collect eggs. But this is how it was explained to me, is that when something is considered rare or a commodity, people just want it just to have it. And so people would go and find these birds' nests to collect those eggs just to say that they had one. And it was a rarity, and it was something that was of value. And so that also caused a decline in this population, because if you even just take one of these eggs, that could have been the one that hatched out to grow up and have a new adult in the population. And so it kind of, for lack of a better word, puts all of your eggs in one basket to hope that that other egg would then hatch out, or they would just take both of them and then lose that chance completely. Also, the millinery trade was a big reason that these birds declined in population size. White feathers especially were very common, or really kind of desired in women's fashion. It was a symbol of status. They were very expensive. Also, white feathers were kind of a symbol of purity. And so white feathers were very desirable for hats. And it was also oftentimes a lot easier to just go and shoot one of these birds to get all the feathers off than just hope that you may find one laying on the ground somewhere. And so these birds were kind of killed for that reason as well. This is well, let me see if I can get it to focus here. This is what a whooping crane body feather looks like. They do have some of those softer plume feathers, but those are very rarely dropped by our captive flock, so we don't have a lot of those right now. But they are beautiful birds, and they have beautiful feathers, so I could see why they were desirable for hats. And then, of course, habitat loss. These birds just don't have a lot of places to be anymore, and so their populations can't grow as much as we want them to, because they just don't have a lot of space to be. Whooping cranes especially require sometimes miles of uninterrupted wetland habitat, and that's just becoming harder and harder to find right now. And so that is kind of lending itself to why these birds aren't increasing in numbers as much as we hope they will, just because they just don't have a place to go. So there are a few things that have helped these birds to rise in not just popularity, but just to help these birds in general. Back in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was started or founded. And so that protected all of those birds from a federal level. In 1934, the duck stamp started, and that has been a huge fundraiser to help protect wildlife and wetlands that not only the cranes use, but mostly for ducks. 1966, the refuge system was started, and so that protected millions of acres for these birds to stay in. 1972, the Clean Water Act was started, which protected the water that these birds are using. And then in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was started. Back in 1973, the whooping crane was one of the first birds to go on the endangered species list because it was so rare at the time. So going back to that original map, you may remember that it showed that most of that northern part of Canada was fully green. And what we're left with now are these two little green spots that we have here in Wood Buffalo National Park and down here in Wisconsin. So the population that visits us in North Alabama and that will be flying over Tennessee is going to be in this eastern migratory population. This is a completely reintroduced population. And you can notice that it's parallel to the other one. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. And so the historic range of these birds is limited to this population, which is what we call the Aransas wood buffalo population. So the majority of the birds that are in this population, they all have come from those original 20. That is the remnant population of what we used to have. And then over in the eastern migratory population, that's completely reintroduced. But the reason these two populations are parallel to one another is pretty much just from the stance of genetic diversity. In case there was a stochastic environmental event, whether if it was a tornado that came through Wood Buffalo National Park, or if there was a hurricane that came through while they were wintering on the coast of Texas and it wiped out a whole bunch of birds, having this eastern migratory population makes these two populations genetically different from one another enough that we can then kind of pull from those to build back up that population. Because there were so few of these birds left, genetic diversity was something that was really important to us going forward with making a new population, because we wanted those birds to be as genetically different as they could be, because we didn't want a genetic bottleneck effect to happen, and then subsequently, cause these birds to be unfit to survive, or birth defects or whatnot that might happen. So Alabama, up at Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge, that is one of the most southern points that these birds will go to. Originally, this population was supposed to migrate all the way down to Florida, but then they kind of stopped short in Wheeler one year. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with this, but if you've ever heard of Operation Migration, or if you've ever seen the movie Fly Away Home, that's the most common way that I can find that people understand what I'm talking about. We figured out how to raise these birds in captivity, but we couldn't really figure out how to get them to migrate. So we figured out how to raise them to the point they could migrate, but really, how do you teach a bird to fly states away from you? And so just like with the Canada geese, so if you've seen Fly Away Home, they use the ultralight aircraft to kind of fly those Canada geese. We adopted that same kind of program for our whooping cranes. And so it was very successful, so successful that we don't use it anymore. It was disbanded back in 2016. But the birds that were taught how to migrate via ultralight aircraft, they are now teaching their own young how to migrate without any human intervention at all. So it's a very successful program. But the reason that these birds don't go all the way to Florida anymore is that one of the Operation Migration trips that was supposed to happen got delayed because of weather, and then we ended up having to just keep them at Wheeler. And then Wheeler is such a good place for these birds that they were like, all right, we don't have to go any farther. That's saving us some miles on these wings. So we're just going to stop over at Wheeler Wildlife Refuge, and that's kind of where they've been ever since. So going into some of our reintroduction projects for whooping cranes, again, we figured out how to raise them in captivity, but the migration was the hard part. But this is kind of going back into how we raise these birds in captivity. So for the most part, we do a lot of artificial insemination for our birds, just to make sure that we're controlling the genetics that are going into each individual. And when we're rearing these birds, a lot of times we're using our crane costumes. And so if you're familiar with imprinting at all, imprinting is when an animal kind of latches onto you as mom or dad. And so to prevent that, we wear these crane costumes that look kind of ridiculous, but they are very effective. So I have one here. I have the top of one right here. So you can see that the patterns on these costumes are very similar to the patterns on the whooping cranes. So they're going to have that same coloration on their forehead. They're going to have that bright yellow eye, and then they're going to have that mustache. And these costumes are so similar in color and in pattern to the adults that when we do release those juveniles into the wild, they know what to look for in a parent or in a mate. So these costumes, while our employees or while our interns are in these costumes, we have to become one with the cranes. And so we are not supposed to talk while we're in these costumes. We're supposed to kind of, if we can, not sneeze, not cough, anything that can kind of give us away as a human. We don't want that to happen. And so much so we have a microphone or a speaker in these costumes that give off a contact call, which is the same call or contact purr, it sounds like a purr, that these adults will use with those babies when they're raising them. So I'm going to go ahead and play that for you too. Can everybody hear that? Sounds like a purring sound. I'll try to play it again. Hopefully you can hear that. But that purring sound, it's just a contact call that those adults will use with those young. And then when we're in these costumes, we actually have a pretty good amount of mobility. So there is a little handle in the mouth area here, so that when you are feeding them, you can kind of teach these birds how to eat with our costumes. So they're really interesting. I personally was never in one of the costumes, but I had plenty of friends who were, and they said it's pretty hard work because it's so kind of hard to get in the mindset of a crane and what a crane does. So it was always interesting listening to them and how their normal day at work was. So once these birds are ready for release, they're very cute when they're little. Once these birds are ready for release, over here on the far right, this is kind of what our releases look like. So we don't just like let these birds out and say, here you go, hope you survive. We try to really give them the best chance of survival as we can. And this is one way that we do this. So we will set up our release pins in areas where adult whooping cranes have been seen, so that hopefully, because these birds are kind of territorial, hopefully those wild adults will come up, be able to see those juveniles on the landscape, but there's still going to be that barrier in between them, so that they don't, there's a less likely chance of those adults kind of going after those juveniles and potentially harming or killing one. So once those juveniles are in that pen for about 2 weeks, and after we kind of hold our breath for as long as we can, we'll drop those fences down and let those juveniles out. And something recently that happened, we did a release about 3 weeks ago. One of the birds immediately joined up with what we're calling foster parents. And so we will hopefully have a juvenile coming down our way pretty soon. So definitely keep your eyes peeled. So if you see one, please let us know. Once these birds are released, though, we do monitor them pretty heavily. Before these birds are put into the wild, we do equip them with transmitters and leg bands. So if you are a duck hunter, or if you are familiar with the band system at all, these bands are just kind of identifiers that we use to help tell these birds apart from one another. There's no really physical way that you can tell the difference between the males or the females, or individuals to individuals. And so there's a couple of different ways that we will do that with our bands and with our transmitters. And so this is what one of well, hopefully you'll show up. This is what one of the transmitters would look like. This is one of our GPS transmitters here. Let me see. There we go. And then this would attach to the leg above the knee. Just sits flush with the, oh goodness, sits flush with the leg. Hopefully you can see that. It doesn't bother the birds at all. They're not very heavy. We have 2 different kinds of transmitters. We have GPS and satellite. So our GPS transmitters are what we would normally use with these big telemetry trackers, and then our GPS transmitters, our biologists can actually let me know that these birds are in our area before I would know they were in our area. So the GPS transmitters help us find where these birds are out on the landscape, and then those bands help us find out who those birds are. So just like a fingerprint, every whooping crane in this population has a different combination of bands on their legs. So in our population, they would be a mix of red, green, black, or white, and in any order of that. And so based off of that band combination, we can look into our database and find out if that bird is a male or female, how old that bird is, if that bird has chicks of its own, who that bird's parents were, if that bird's parents were operation migration birds or not. So we get lots and lots of information from those bands, but we do look out for those transmitters and those bands while they're out on the landscape. But we also get help from the public for citizen science and getting those that band information. And the way that we do that is we have a database where you can report abandoned whooping crane. There is also a place where you can report banded sandhill cranes. And if you're interested in that, I can definitely let you know what that is too. But if you want to report a banded whooping crane, please do. We would love to see where these birds are on our landscape. So first thing you would do, confirm that you saw a whooping crane. If you want to do that, you can go to this website right here, which is whippermap.savingcranes.org. Excuse me. And so that website, it will show you where we have had band sightings or where we have had like GPS pings of their transmitters. And so it's a day by day kind of watch of where these birds are on the landscape, which is, I think it's really interesting. I check it all the time. So if they are in your area, you can report your sighting at bandedcranes.org, where you would just put in the band combination that you saw. If you have a picture, you have the option to include a picture with that, and also your exact location of where you saw it. The only thing that we ask is that if you do report a banded crane, that you don't give out that exact location to anybody else but us. We ask that you just kind of keep it to like a county-wide level, because these birds are so protected and they are kind of in a fragile state. We don't want a lot of people kind of going into their space and bombarding them. And a lot of times these birds are on private property, and I'm sure those landowners do not want a lot of people coming over to their land to see those birds either. So if you can just kind of keep it to a county level when you're telling people, we would appreciate it, but definitely let us know that exact location so we can keep our records as accurate as possible. From those oh goodness, tripping on my words. From those band reports, we can also gather this information of where these birds are kind of during different months. And so this is just a picture showing where these birds would be found in our area. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is this is right over where Chattanooga is, correct? Is that around Hiawassee?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that that was right. So there has been a whooping crane found over there in Hiawassee. So that may be a little bit closer to you than us. I'm not sure. But having that band information really helps us to find where these birds potentially may have a population later on. So we're using this information to build on itself every year to get good readings about where these birds may be. So this is the most updated number that we have. I didn't tell you guys this yet. I kind of kept it a secret until now, but we do have about 836 of these birds in the world right now. Out of these, only about 650 of them are wild birds. The other 150, 175 or so, those are in captivity in different breeding programs, or if they are unable to be released into the wild, we will sometimes use them just to get their genetics. But we do have agreements with a lot of different zoos and organizations that we will get those genetics to use for our reintroduction programs. In our population that visits us, we have about 76 birds, but of those 76, not all of them come to Alabama. I wish. Not all of them stop over in Tennessee. I wish. But they kind of stop over throughout. So they're starting in Wisconsin, and then they'll kind of start bigger and then trickle down in numbers before they get to us. At our highest point last year, we did have 19 whooping cranes in Alabama. And then about halfway through the season, we had 3 of those birds continue to go further south into South Georgia. And then we had 2 birds that were kind of staying around the Stevenson area, which is fairly close to Chattanooga, right across the state line from Chattanooga. So just like with sandhill cranes, power line collision is a big reason that these birds are kind of declining. Unfortunately, when these birds see those power lines, often it's too late for them to move out of the way, and it does result in them having broken necks. And at that point, there's really nothing that we can do to help them. But also poaching. We've had our most recent poaching case was not in our population. It was in Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma, there was the most detrimental poaching incident with 4 birds taken at one time. And so that is a huge blow to the genetics of this population, and also just kind of hurts our feelings too. These birds, to raise them into full adults, it can take about $100,000 per bird to get them to the point where they can migrate. And that's just manpower, care, vet care, equipment, all of that that's going into these animals. And every time there's a poaching incident, it's just kind of a blow below the belt. Very sad for everyone involved. Going back, power line collisions, those flight diverters are really important. Poaching, poaching is not hunting. If anybody ever says that, they're not right. But when we say that these are not hunter related, that's going off the basis that these people who are killing these animals are either hunting outside of normal hunting hours or hunting seasons, or using incorrect, well, with whooping cranes, there's no correct firearms because you're not supposed to hunt them at all. But just in areas where these birds are on private property, there have been some people that have kind of tried to get them off of that private property. So most of these incidents have been happening in white males around the 26-year-old range. And so just outreach in general, we've been trying to kind of combat that just by getting the word out about these birds and being advocates for them. And since we've started, let me go back. Since we've started our program back in 2015, we went from having 13 shooting incidents with 18 birds being taken. Since 2015, we've only had 2 shooting incidents. So in our mind, from what we can see, the outreach is working, just getting people excited that these birds are in their area. So hopefully that will continue to work and we won't have any more poaching incidents. But in a case where these birds may be what word am I looking for? In the case where these birds may be poached, this is a good example of what it may look like. So this is a pair of whooping cranes that are out on a private agricultural field, and this could be a case of someone shooting these birds from the road or from somebody not wanting these birds on their property. Either way, not a very cool thing to shoot these birds. Please don't. But this is an incident where that may occur. And so one of the people that we bring up in the case of poaching is Jeff G. Blatchford. And I know Wild Ones is more so focused on the native plants in our area, but we're all kind of naturalists at heart. So we know, the do's and don'ts of wildlife and wild places. And Jeff G. Blatchford was kind of just all over not a good guy. He was notorious for shooting ducks out of the ditches, out of his truck, shooting hawks off of power lines, all sorts of bad things that you can do with wildlife and birds in general. But when he was asked about it, nobody ever asked him if he had shot an eagle before, but he just willingly gave up that information. Well, I've never shot an eagle, but I have done X, Y, and Z. And so even though he wasn't asked about that, we were kind of wondering, like, why would he say that if he's not done it? But okay. But there's a sense of pride surrounding eagles. It's our national bird. Everybody knows about it. It's a conservation success story going from such a small number and growing into what it is now. And so not only are there laws that are put into place and acts that are put into place to protect eagles, but from a human standpoint, he may have been shunned by his community if somebody had heard that he had shot an eagle. There's just such a sense of pride surrounding those birds that a lot of other birds don't have. And so we're trying to get whooping cranes, and in my opinion, all birds, up to the point where nobody would want to do that. So the outreach program is kind of put into place to help get that started. This is just showing again, before 2015 and after 2015, I was mistaken, we only had 1 incident. No, I'm sorry, we did have 2. There's one up here past Michigan. 2 shooting incidents. Luckily, neither of them were close to us. Most recent one that was close to us was back in 2011. And that was right when these birds were coming into the area. And so it was just a really new species to have. And somebody probably just didn't know what it was and shot it because it was something different. So if you're wondering what you can do to help cranes, continue what you were doing with your habitat restoration, working with your native plant communities, making these spaces good areas for the cranes. Like I said, they are omnivores. They'll eat pretty much anything. So if you have a good diverse native plants selection, you will have those native animals again coming in that these birds would love to snack on. But some other things that you can do is now you should be able to identify the cranes that are in your area. If you see any banded birds, go to bandedcranes.org. Just tell your friends about them. If you learned something new today that you didn't know before about cranes, just getting the word out about them and getting people excited that they're in our area is always important, not just for cranes, but for any species. And then if you're just interested in learning more about the International Crane Foundation as a whole, you can head over to our website at savingcranes.org, where you can find out more about sandhill cranes and whooping cranes, but also other restoration projects and other species of cranes that we work with over the world, all over the world. So again, going back to that Sandhill Crane Festival, this is the fanciest version of this I could find. I don't think there's an actual like press release yet, but the Tennessee Sandhill Crane Festival is going to be January 14th, 2023, and so that's happening at the same time, unfortunately, as our Festival of the Cranes in Decatur. But either one you go to, if you get to go to one, they're both going to be really fun events. I know at both events there's going to be raptor shows that are happening. At Festival of the Cranes, we're going to have our big 8-foot Hope mascot. So if you would like to get some pictures taken with her, you can. But those are both coming up fairly shortly or fairly soon, and we're very much so looking forward to being at both of those. So with that, I hope you all give a whoop about whooping cranes as much as I do now. Hopefully I didn't talk too much. Like I said, I tried to keep it short, but sometimes it's really difficult. But does anybody have any questions? I really haven't looked at the chat.
I have. So since I introduced you, I was monitoring this also.
Yeah.
Got a couple of questions here. One is, does the sandhill crane eye color change with maturity?
Yes, both of the cranes, they do. Fun fact about all of the cranes is that each species of the 15 cranes, or each of the 15 cranes in the cranes family, they all have a different shade of eye color. And so our sandhill cranes are going to have like a dark orangey red, like fire looking eye color. And then our whooping cranes are going to have like a bright yellow eye. But when they're young, they both start out as blue. So they look more like a brighter blue when they're younger, but then they will grow into that different eye color.
Okay. And the average lifespan of the sandhill and whooping crane?
So sandhills and whooping cranes in the wild, they're fairly similar in lifespan. Sandhill cranes, we estimate between like 30 to 40 in the wild, really with whooping cranes as well. But in captivity, we have had both species live into their 50s. Cranes in general are considered a symbol of longevity in a lot of different cultures. We actually had a Siberian crane whose name was Wolf that lived until he was 83.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
So are there bird years like there are dog years? So this thing like 450 years old?
I would assume he was about 450 years old.
That's
I don't know
amazing.
that though.
Yeah.
I know it's really impressive to think of a bird. And I think there's an albatross that's in their 60s or 70s right now. So birds are very cool, and you never really know like why they live to be as old as they are.
So Brent Miller or Patricia, one of the two, posted also the Wildlife Resources Agency at the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency thing in Birchwood School in Birchwood, Tennessee in January. And just so you know, you've already inspired somebody. Leslie Watts is on her way through Wheeler to honor Thanksgiving and going to stop by to see this event
Awesome.
out. So,
Yeah.
and then they'll be at Hiawassee in January. So now you
That's
got look
incredible.
at this.
I do know that right now the visitor center is under renovations at Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge, but their observation building, I just got word from one of their rangers on Friday, actually, that they're really hoping that the observation building will be open to the public by November the 1st. And so we should be starting to see cranes by then. My favorite time to see cranes is around like the second week in December. That's when I see the most birds there. But I'm just excited that the observation building is going to be open because it's been closed since March. So really excited for that.
And one more question just popped up. Is
Yeah.
kayaking out to see the sandhills disturb the birds? Can you?
Let me see. That's a great question. I was just looking at the chat. So we do have lots and lots of trails that go or kayaking spots where you can get out fairly close to these birds. The Tennessee Valley Authority does have the ability to raise and lower the water levels where these birds are staying at Wheeler. And so there are a lot of shallower areas where these birds are staying, which kind of keeps you far enough away from them to bother them. I haven't seen any boats or kayaks bother these birds. If you can, we say to stay at least 200 yards away from them. But if they are bothered, they will all kind of fly off in droves. So it won't just be one bird. They're fairly skittish. So if one bird goes, they think that there's an immediate threat in the area. They'll kind of all go. But I do know that the Flint Creek Trail, you can kayak the Flint Creek, and that's a really popular one for birders, because not only do we have cranes this time of year, we already have pelicans right now. We have lots of migratory waterfowl that come down. We do get snow geese. If it's cold enough, some of the swans will come down. We had some loons last year, which was really cool. So if you do get out and get to go kayaking, definitely keep your binoculars on you because it's not just cranes that you will see. You will see a lot of really, really cool birds.
Anybody else?
Yeah. I tried to make it as quick as I could. I'm so sorry I went over time.
No. We all of us who do this, whether it's for a living or it's a real significant hobby of ours, you give us a time frame and it's hard to stay inside of it. So
I know.
no, it's okay. Don't worry.
I did some hunter education programs this past weekend, and they said keep it between 25 and 30 minutes. And I'm like, probably not going to happen, but I will try my best.
Cut out a third of your slides and
yeah.
talk
But I
twice
think
as
it's all
fast.
important information, and I think it's all really interesting. But stuff that I think is interesting isn't always interesting to others. But talking to different nature groups and naturalists, we're all kind of nerds at heart, I think. And so I think it kind of is a lot easier to talk to you than it is other people who may not be interested in it. So
Well, be sure and
Yeah,
take another look at the chat so you can
Now we're
see
getting
all
to
the
thank yous.
thank yous and the compliments that you got, Jessie. I think you held everybody's interest quite well.
thank you.
I have a comment.
Sure.
I was privileged to go down to Wheeler either last year or year before in a kayak and see the sandhill cranes down there. And I wrote on the photograph as a notation, this was one of the best days of my life. It was an incredible wildlife spectacle. You just can't imagine when you hear, I mean, we heard a little sound recording, but when you hear them all together and it's the thunderous birds and they're all, talking to each other and you get to see them fly in and fly off. And it's just incredible. It really, it's an experience I hope I always remember. I used to say I'll always remember something. I don't say that, but I loved it. It was just, get you in your heart. It makes you feel happy to see something doing well out there and talking about it.
It is very impressive. The sound, there is truly nothing like being in an area. Last year we had at our highest point, we estimated there was about 17,000 sandhill cranes at Wheeler, just in the vicinity of our visitor center and observation building. And that's not really including the other thousands of acres that we had. But when you're in that situation and all of the birds are calling, it just like kind of envelops you, and you hear it and you feel it in your bones. It's so cool. It's so
Yes,
impressive.
you do. And you know, the water, you don't have the water where we were was only a couple of feet deep. So we didn't worry about falling. I talked to an old timer before I went, and he said, you don't have to worry about falling in. If you do, you're only going to be, you know, not that deep. So, and it was a warm, sunny day in November. We went November 4th, and we got to see a lot of birds. So it was neat.
I think for right now, I was just up there this past Friday. We don't have any cranes yet. I think it's still a little too warm for them up north to push them down here right now. But I'm hoping that in the next couple of weeks, we do have a few that show up. They will start to kind of grow exponentially. One day we may see about 50 birds. The next day it may be about 150 birds. The next day it's 500 birds, then 2,000 birds. And so it's just like they pop up overnight. And then every time you go, it's a different experience. But watch out where you go. In Wheeler, there are some alligators at Wheeler. So if you do go kayaking, make sure that you are checking your creeks and trails, that you're not in the alligator water. It's not super common, but they are up there. So be careful.
Anybody else? Thank you so much. Richard, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Jessie, this was great. So really appreciate your taking the time to speak to us. And we enjoyed we had a refreshing break from native plants for a good meeting. So we appreciate that. Just so everybody will know, normally we meet on the fourth Monday of the month, but that doesn't work so well for November and December. So what we're doing is meeting the first Monday in December, and we're excited to have Cynthia Rohrbach, a Tennessee Conservationist of the Year from several years ago, from the Swan Conservation Trust, giving a presentation about the work that they do protecting the headwaters of Big Swan Creek. And so she gave a speech to us, I think about our third or fourth meeting as a chapter. So it's been several years since we've heard from her. So she's going to update us about some new land that they've acquired and some volunteer work that our chapter has done to help remove invasive species. So that'll be first Monday of December. And if there's no other question or comment, I think we can call it a night, and let's all tell Jessie how much we enjoyed it. And I'll send you a copy of the chat so you can read it whenever you're feeling down, if you ever feel down. You seem pretty enthusiastic. So.
Anytime I get to talk about birds and let my passion come through, I'm always excited about it. I can be talking about worms in the dirt. That's fine by me.
Well, we see where from Rita's comment, we now fully understand where you get your enthusiasm. You have you're privileged to have the job that you have, I would say.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jessie.
Thank you so much. Y'all have a good night. Thank you
You too.
again.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, Richard.